Have you ever wondered why people in the Bible lived for hundreds of years before the flood? But after the flood, their lifespans became much shorter. This question has puzzled many, and today, we're going to explore the real reason behind this change. In Genesis, before the flood, people like Adam and Methuselah lived for almost 1,000 years. But after the flood, in Genesis 6:3, God declared that human lifespans would be limited to 120 years. Why did this happen? Understanding why God shortened human lifespans after the flood is important, because it helps us better understand God's plan for humanity. It shows us the connection between the flood, the condition of the earth, and how God responded to human sin. By studying this change, we can learn more about God's character and the world He created. In this video, we'll dive into the reasons behind this dramatic shift, looking at both the biblical and historical context. The answers might surprise you, and they can help us understand more about the world and life today. Stay with us as we explore the real reason God shortened man's lifespan after the flood. Before the flood, people in the Bible lived incredibly long lives, far longer than what we experience today. For example, Adam, the first man, lived 930 years, Genesis 5:5. Methuselah, the longest-lived person in the Bible, reached 969 years, Genesis 5:27. These long lifespans are very different from how long people live now, which is usually under 100 years. The long lives of people before the flood were significant for several reasons. First, it showed how God created the world to be different in the beginning. The earth and its environment were likely more perfect, with fewer diseases and challenges that shorten life. People also had more time to build relationships, pass down knowledge, and fulfill God's purpose for their lives. Key Bible verses like Genesis 5:6-31 list the ages of the patriarchs, showing how long each person lived. For example, Seth, Adam's son, lived 912 years, Genesis 5:8, and Noah, who survived the flood, lived 950 years, Genesis 9:29. These long lifespans helped to spread the knowledge of God and His ways through many generations, as people had more time to teach their children and grandchildren. But these long lifespans weren't just about living longer. They were also a way for God to populate the earth and establish His plan for humanity. People were living longer, but the world was also becoming more corrupt, which leads us to the story of the flood. The change in lifespans after the flood is a response to what happened before it. Understanding these long lives gives us context for the shift that came later. The Great Flood was one of the most significant events in the Bible. It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a judgment from God. In Genesis 6:5, we learn that the world had become very wicked. People were violent, selfish, and their hearts were filled with evil. God saw this and decided to send the flood to cleanse the earth and start over. He chose to save one righteous man, Noah, and his family, sparing them from the flood as they obeyed God's instructions. Noah and his family were the only survivors because they followed God's commands. God told Noah to build an ark, a large boat, to protect his family and pairs of every animal. When the floodwaters came, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their sons' wives were safe inside the ark. The flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights, covering the earth and wiping out all living things that did not enter the ark. Genesis 7:17-24. After the floodwaters receded, Noah and his family came out of the ark to a new world. In Genesis 9:1-7, God made a special promise, known as a covenant, with Noah and his descendants. God blessed Noah and told him to be fruitful and multiply, filling the earth again. Genesis 9:1. God also promised never to destroy the earth with a flood again, giving the rainbow as a sign of this promise. Genesis 9:13-17. Additionally, God gave Noah and his family new instructions on how to live, including rules about respecting life and animals. This covenant with Noah marked the beginning of a new chapter for humanity, where God's plan to restore the world was set in motion. It was a fresh start, but also a reminder of the consequences of sin. After the flood, God made a significant change to how long people would live. In Genesis 6:3, God declares, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." This is the moment when God limits human lifespans to 120 years, a big shift from the many hundreds of years people lived before the flood. So why did God decide to shorten people's lifespans after the flood? The key reason is found in the context of what happened before the flood. Before the flood, humanity had become incredibly wicked, and people were living for such a long time that they had the chance to spread sin even further across the earth. God saw that humanity's hearts were continually evil, Genesis 6:5, and this led to the decision to shorten their time on earth as part of his judgment. God's decision to limit lifespans to 120 years can also be seen as an act of mercy. By reducing the amount of time people could live, God was giving them less time to become as corrupt as those before the flood. It's also a way of putting a limit on the evil that people could do, as shorter lifespans meant there would be less time for sin to grow. This change reflected a new phase in God's relationship with humanity, where he still offered grace, but also showed his seriousness about justice. The shift from living nearly 1,000 years to living much shorter lives was a major change in God's design for the world. It marked a new era where people would live less time but still be accountable for their actions. This change sets the stage for how human history would unfold after the flood. The decision to shorten human lifespans after the flood carries deep theological and historical meaning. One of the main reasons for this change is tied to human sin and corruption. Before the flood, humanity had become incredibly wicked, and their hearts were filled with evil, Genesis 6:5. The long lifespans allowed sin to spread over many generations, causing the world to become more corrupt. After the flood, God decided to limit people's lives to 120 years to prevent sin from growing unchecked. Shorter lives would mean less time for people to fall deeper into sin, which was God's way of dealing with the ongoing problem of human corruption. The impact of sin on the earth also played a role in God's decision. The flood itself was a direct response to the overwhelming evil that had spread across the world. Sin had damaged the earth and its people to such an extent that God needed to cleanse it with the flood. Afterward, he didn't want humanity to have the same amount of time to bring even more destruction. Shortening their lifespans was a way to limit further damage and give people a shorter window to live out their sinful tendencies. Another important reason for reducing lifespans was to limit the negative influence of humanity's wickedness. By shortening the number of years people lived, God reduced the possibility of generations becoming more and more corrupt. It was a way to maintain justice and balance in the world. While God still gave humanity the chance to live and grow, he wanted to make sure that sin didn't spread beyond control. This shift in lifespan was a form of mercy, as it helped slow down the spread of evil and allowed for more time for God's plan of redemption. After the flood, human nature and sin continued to affect humanity, even though God had wiped out much of the evil. In Genesis 8:21, God says, "The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." This shows that the problem of sin is deep within human nature. Even after the flood, people still had sinful hearts, and this remained a challenge. The flood didn't erase sin from the hearts of humans. It only removed the most corrupt generations. Sin still lived inside every person, and it would continue to affect how people acted and how the world changed. The environment and human nature also changed after the flood. Before the flood, the earth was in a perfect state, and people lived much longer, possibly because the environment was more ideal. After the flood, the earth was different. The environment may have been harsher, with the destruction caused by the flood and the changes in climate. As a result, people started to live shorter lives, and the world became less hospitable. The challenge of mankind's heart, as mentioned in Genesis 8:21, directly relates to the change in lifespans. God knew that even though the flood had cleansed the earth, human beings still had a tendency to sin. By shortening lifespans, God limited how long people could live with that sin in their hearts. A shorter life meant less time to allow sin to spread and cause harm. God's decision to shorten human lives was a way to reduce the damage that sin could do. It also reminded people that life is precious and that they should focus on living righteously, as they no longer had the same long lifetimes to waste. There are a few different ways to think about why God shortened human lifespans after the flood. Some people look at the changes through a scientific lens, while others see deeper symbolic meanings behind this shift. One scientific theory is that the environment changed after the flood. Before the flood, the Earth may have had a different atmosphere or climate that allowed people to live much longer. Some scientists suggest that the Earth's conditions could have been more stable, with less disease and more natural protection, which could explain why people lived for hundreds of years. After the flood, the Earth was radically changed. The atmosphere, weather patterns, and even the availability of resources might have been altered. This could have made it harder for people to live as long as they did before. A harsher environment might have played a role in the shorter lifespans people experienced after the flood. On the symbolic side, the shortening of lifespans can be seen as a reminder of humanity's broken relationship with God due to sin. The long lifespans before the flood represented a time when people had more opportunities to learn from God, but also more time to fall into evil. Shorter lifespans after the flood may symbolize the limited time humans have on earth to live righteously and fulfill God's purposes. It reminds us that life is temporary and that our actions have consequences. In a way, it's a call to live wisely and in accordance with God's will, knowing that our time is limited. Both the scientific and symbolic views help us understand why God made this significant change and how it relates to the world's environment and human nature after the flood. The change in human lifespans after the flood can teach us important lessons about God's character and His intentions for humanity. One of the key lessons is that God is both just and merciful. Before the flood, people had hundreds of years to live, but they used that time for evil. After the flood, God shortened human lifespans to limit the spread of sin and its consequences. This shows that God is serious about justice, but also that He wants to give people a chance to change and live righteously. God's decision to shorten lifespans also shows that life is precious. In today's world, it's easy to take life for granted, but the shorter lifespans after the flood remind us that our time on earth is limited. We should use the time we have wisely, living in a way that honors God. This is a reminder to focus on what really matters, like building a good relationship with God and living out His will. For modern believers, there are several lessons we can learn from God's actions in the post-flood world. First, we should recognize that sin still affects us today. Just like after the flood, humans still have a sinful nature that can lead us away from God. But just as God offered mercy after the flood, He still offers grace and forgiveness to those who seek Him. The flood was a fresh start for humanity, and God still gives us the chance for new beginnings through Jesus Christ. Finally, the change in lifespans teaches us to live with a sense of urgency. Our time on earth is limited, so we should make the most of it, living in a way that reflects God's love and truth. To recap, the real reason behind the shortening of man's lifespan after the flood can be understood through both the judgment and mercy of God. Before the flood, humanity had become so sinful and corrupt that their long lifespans allowed evil to spread across generations. After the flood, God limited human lifespans to 120 years as a way to reduce the impact of sin and keep evil in check. This was a sign of God's justice, but it was also a way to protect humanity from falling deeper into sin. It was a reminder that life is temporary and precious, and people would not have forever to do wrong. Instead, they had a shorter time to live righteously and honor God. This change in lifespans also fits into the bigger picture of biblical history and theology. The flood represents a moment of judgment, but also a fresh start for humanity. God's decision to shorten lifespans after the flood shows His ongoing concern for humanity's well-being. He did not abandon humanity, but gave them a new opportunity to live in a way that honored Him. The limitation on lifespans also points to the bigger truth that sin still affects humanity, and we must live wisely, recognizing that our time on earth is limited. If you found this discussion helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future videos like this one. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below with your theories or insights on why God shortened human lifespans after the flood. Do you think there are other reasons behind this change that we haven't discussed yet? Share your thoughts with us. Also, don't forget to share this video with others who might find it interesting. Together, we can keep exploring the deep truths of the Bible and uncover more about God's plan for humanity. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.